The rain came down like bullets that November night in 1883, and Lillian Montgomery knew she was going to die out here in this God-forsaken wilderness if she didn't find shelter soon. She had been foolish to leave the stagecoach station at Prescott, Arizona territory, thinking she could make it to Fort Yuma before the storm hit, but desperation had clouded her judgment. Her horse had thrown a shoe 5 miles back, and she'd been leading the limping animal through the downpour ever since, her dress plastered to her skin, her teeth chattering so violently she thought they might crack. The temperature had dropped with shocking speed as the sun disappeared, and what had started as cold rain now felt like needles of ice against her exposed skin. Her fingers had gone numb an hour ago, and she could barely feel her feet inside her soaked boots. The road had become a river of mud, and she stumbled more than walked, pulling her reluctant horse behind her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt her toes. The shivering had become so violent that her whole body convulsed with each breath. Lillian had grown up in Boston, where winter meant fireplaces and warm parlors, not this brutal exposure to nature's fury. She'd come west 3 months ago after her father's death left her penniless, answering an advertisement for a school teacher position in a small mining town near Fort Yuma. The position had fallen through when she arrived, the school having closed due to lack of funding, and she'd been scraping by doing laundry and mending for the few families in the area. Today she'd been attempting to reach Fort Yuma itself, where she'd heard there might be work, but now all of that seemed impossibly distant. Her vision blurred, and she wasn't sure if it was from the rain or from the exhaustion that pulled at every limb. Just as her knees began to buckle, just as she thought she might simply lie down in the mud and let the storm take her, a light appeared through the sheets of rain. Not the cold light of lightning, but the warm, steady glow of a lantern. Lillian tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a croak. She stumbled forward, dragging her horse, and the light grew closer. A building materialized from the darkness, a sturdy cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, and standing in the doorway with a lantern held high was a tall figure in a wide-brimmed hat. The man stepped out into the rain without hesitation, striding toward her with purpose. As he drew near, Lillian could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 28 or 29, with strong features and eyes that reflected concern even in the dim light. He wore typical cowboy attire, denim pants and a heavy canvas coat, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew this land. "Madam," he said, his voice deep and steady, cutting through the roar of the storm. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" He didn't wait for an answer, taking in her condition with a quick, assessing glance. His hand went to her horse's bridle, and he looked back at her face, rain streaming off the brim of his hat. "No one should face this storm alone. Come on, let's get you inside before you freeze to death." Lillian tried to respond, tried to thank him, but her jaw wouldn't cooperate. She felt his arm go around her waist, supporting her weight as though she were made of paper, and he guided her toward the cabin while leading her horse with his other hand. The warmth hit her like a physical force as they entered, and she gasped, her body suddenly aware of just how close to the edge she'd been. The cabin was small but well-maintained, with a stone fireplace where a healthy fire crackled and popped. There was a simple wooden table with 2 chairs, a bed in one corner, and shelves lined with supplies and books. "Sit here," the man commanded, not unkindly, guiding her to a chair near the fire. He draped a thick wool blanket around her shoulders and then moved with practiced efficiency, adding wood to the fire and then disappearing back outside. Lillian heard him leading her horse to what must be a stable or shed, and then he was back, shaking water from his hat and closing the door firmly against the storm. He hung his hat on a peg and turned to face her properly for the first time. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the ends where it had gotten wet, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and eyes that were a striking shade of gray-green. There was something solid about him, something that spoke of reliability and competence. He moved to a cabinet and pulled out a clean towel and what looked like dry clothing. "Name's Preston Quillen," he said, handing her the towel. "This is my place, about 10 miles outside of Prescott. You're safe here." He set the dry clothes, which appeared to be one of his own shirts and some long underwear, on the table beside her. "You need to get out of those wet things, madam. I'll turn my back and tend to making some hot coffee, but you've got to get dry or hypothermia will set in if it hasn't already." "Lillian," she managed through chattering teeth. "Lillian M. Montgomery. Well, Miss Montgomery, I'm going to be very direct with you because your life might depend on it. You need to remove everything that's wet and get into these dry clothes. Your modesty is understandable, but it'll be the death of you if you don't warm up properly." He was already turning away, busying himself at the stove in the corner. "I give you my word as a gentleman that I won't look, but please hurry." Lillian's fingers fumbled with the buttons of her dress, so numb she could barely make them work. The fabric clung to her skin, heavy and cold, and she struggled with increasing desperation. A small sound of frustration escaped her throat, and Preston glanced over his shoulder before quickly looking away again. "Can't manage the buttons?" he asked quietly. "No," she admitted, humiliation burning through the cold. "I can't feel my fingers." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Miss Montgomery, with your permission, I could help with the buttons. I promise you I'm a man of honor. I've got 2 sisters back in Texas, and I'd hope someone would help them in a similar situation." Lillian knew she had no choice. "Please," she whispered. Preston approached slowly, keeping his eyes focused on the task at hand with professional detachment. His own fingers, warm and calloused, made quick work of the small buttons down her back. The moment the dress was loosened, he stepped away immediately, returning to the stove. "There, you can manage the rest." With the dress unbuttoned, Lillian was able to peel the soaking garments away from her skin. She pulled the dry shirt over her head, grateful that it fell nearly to her knees, and then managed to get the long underwear on beneath it. The clothes smelled of soap and wood smoke, and something distinctly masculine but not unpleasant. Once she was covered, she wrapped the blanket around herself again and said softly, "Thank you. You can turn around now." Preston turned, holding 2 tin cups of steaming coffee. He handed her one and pulled the other chair closer to the fire, sitting down with his own cup. "Drink it slow," he advised. "Your body needs to warm up gradually." He studied her face in the firelight, and she became aware of how she must look, with her dark blonde hair hanging in wet ropes around her shoulders and her face probably pale as milk. "What were you doing out there? There's nothing between here and Prescott but empty country." Lillian wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the heat seep into her frozen fingers. "I was trying to reach Fort Yuma. I left Prescott this afternoon, thought I could make it before the storm. My horse threw a shoe, and then the rain came." She took a sip of the coffee, feeling it burn a warm path down her throat. "I was foolish. Brave, maybe, or desperate, but we all do foolish things sometimes." Preston's voice held no judgment. "Fort Yuma is a good 100 miles southwest of here. You weren't going to make that journey in a day, not even with a sound horse and good weather. I know that now." Lillian felt tears prick at her eyes and force them back. She would not cry in front of this stranger, this man who had saved her life. "I've made nothing but poor decisions since I came west. I thought there would be opportunities here, thought I could make a life for myself, but everything has gone wrong." Preston was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee and watching the fire. "The West isn't easy on anyone, but it's particularly hard on women traveling alone. What brought you out here in the first place, if you don't mind my asking?" And so Lillian found herself telling him everything. How her father had been a teacher in Boston, how they had lived modestly but comfortably until he'd fallen ill 2 years ago, how the medical bills had consumed their savings, and how his death had left her not only grieving but destitute. How she'd seen the advertisement for a teaching position and had used the last of her money to make the journey west, only to find the position no longer existed. How she'd been surviving day to day ever since, taking whatever work she could find, always one step away from complete disaster. Preston listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. When she finished, he refilled her coffee cup and said, "That takes courage, what you've done. Coming all this way, not giving up even when things went wrong. A lot of people would have just folded. I'm not sure courage is the right word. I didn't have any other choice." "There's always a choice," Preston said quietly. "You could have married the first man who offered, could have taken the easy path. But you didn't. You kept fighting." He stood and went to a cupboard, pulling out bread and dried meat. "You must be hungry. When did you last eat?" Lillian realized with a start that she couldn't remember. "Yesterday morning, I think." Preston shook his head and began assembling a meal, slicing bread and meat with efficient movements. "No wonder you look half dead. Hunger and cold are a dangerous combination." He brought her a plate loaded with food and watched until she began to eat. "You'll stay here tonight, obviously." The storm won't break before morning, and even then, your horse needs rest and proper shoeing before you can travel." "I don't want to impose," Lillian protested automatically, even though the thought of going back out into the storm made her want to weep. "It's not an imposition. It's basic human decency." Preston's tone left no room for argument. "You'll take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire. Tomorrow we'll assess the situation and figure out what comes next." Lillian was too exhausted to argue further. She ate mechanically, barely tasting the food, but feeling strength slowly return to her limbs. Preston sat across from her, his own plate in hand, and they ate in companionable silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the drum of rain on the roof. She found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking, noticing the strength in his hands, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the calm competence that seemed to radiate from him. When she'd finished eating, Preston collected the plates and set them aside to be washed later. "The bed is yours," he said, gesturing to the corner. "There are extra blankets in the chest if you need them. Don't worry about anything tonight. Just rest." Lillian stood, still wrapped in the blanket, and moved toward the bed. It was simple but clean, with a real mattress and thick quilts. "Mr. Quillen," she said, turning to face him, "I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life tonight." Preston met her eyes, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "No thanks needed, Miss Montgomery. I'm just glad I was here." He turned away to bank the fire, and Lillian climbed into the bed, still wearing his shirt and long underwear, and pulled the quilts up to her chin. She expected to lie awake, too aware of the strange man in the room, too keyed up from her near-death experience, but exhaustion claimed her almost immediately. She woke once in the night, disoriented, and saw Preston sitting in the chair by the fire, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, his head tipped back against the wall. He was asleep, and in the firelight, he looked younger, less guarded. Lillian felt a strange warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, and she drifted back to sleep with the sound of his breathing a steady counterpoint to the rain. Morning arrived with pale gray light filtering through the cabin's single window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and dripping. Lillian woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then memory rushed back, and she sat up quickly, her hair tumbling around her shoulders. Preston was at the stove, his back to her, and he turned when he heard her movement. "Morning," he said with a slight smile. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Lillian admitted, though her voice was rough with sleep. "Much better, thank you." She glanced down at herself, still wearing his clothes, and felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I should get dressed." "Your clothes are dry," Preston said, gesturing to where her dress and undergarments hung near the fire. "I hung them up last night after you fell asleep. They should be wearable now." He turned his attention back to the stove. "Breakfast will be ready in a few minutes. Take your time." Lillian gathered her clothes, grateful they were indeed dry, even if wrinkled, and moved behind a curtain that partitioned off a small area of the cabin. She changed quickly, her fingers working properly now in the warmth, and emerged to find Preston setting plates on the table. They sat down to bacon, eggs, and fresh biscuits, and Lillian ate with genuine appetite, amazed at how much better she felt with rest and warmth and food. "I checked on your horse this morning," Preston said between bites. "She's sound except for that shoe. I can put a new one on, but it'll take me a few hours to do it properly." "I can pay you," Lillian said quickly, though she knew her funds were desperately low. Preston waved a hand dismissively. "Let's not worry about payment right now. What we need to discuss is your plan. You can't make it to Fort Yuma on your own, Miss Montgomery. It's too far, and the trail between here and there is unforgiving even in good weather. With winter coming on, it's downright dangerous." Lillian set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. "I don't have many options, Mr. Quillen. I need work, and I heard there might be opportunities in Fort Yuma." "There might be," Preston agreed, "but there are also opportunities closer to hand." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I could use some help here." Lillian looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I run a small cattle operation," Preston explained. "Nothing fancy, but it keeps me busy. Too busy, if I'm honest. I've been thinking about hiring someone to help with the domestic side of things, the cooking and cleaning and such, so I can focus more on the cattle and the land. The pay wouldn't be much, but it would include room and board, and you'd be safe." "You're offering me a job?" Lillian couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "Mr. Quillen, You don't know me. I could be anyone. I could be a thief or worse. Preston smiled, and it transformed his face, making him look boyish and open. I'm a pretty good judge of character, Miss Montgomery, and I think I've got your measure. You're honest, hardworking, and determined. You're also in a tough spot, and I can help. It seems like a practical solution for both of us. Lillian wanted to accept immediately, wanted to seize this lifeline he was offering, but caution held her back. Mr. Quillen, I appreciate your kindness, but what would people say? A single woman living on a ranch with a single man? My reputation would be ruined. Fair point, Preston acknowledged. Here's what I propose. There's a family, the Hendersons, who have a spread about 3 miles north of here. Sam Henderson and his wife Clara have 6 kids and are good, decent people. You could stay with them if you prefer, come here during the day to work, and return to their place at night. That way, propriety is observed, and you have the safety of a family nearby. It was a sensible solution, and Lillian found herself nodding slowly. That might work, but I should meet these people first, make sure they're agreeable to the arrangement. Absolutely, Preston agreed. We can ride over there today once I've got your horse shod. Clara Henderson is one of the kindest women I've ever met. I think you'll like her. The tension in Lillian's shoulders eased slightly. This was more than she'd dared hope for just 12 hours ago. A job, a place to stay, safety. Thank you, Mr. Quillen. I accept your offer, pending Mrs. Henderson's approval. Call me Preston, he said, extending his hand across the table. If we're going to be working together, we should dispense with the formalities. Lillian took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. Then you should call me Lillian. His smile widened. Lillian it is. After breakfast, Preston went out to the small barn to work on her horse, and Lillian insisted on cleaning up the cabin and starting preparations for the midday meal. She found supplies well stocked and organized, and she set about making a simple stew with dried beef and vegetables. As she worked, she looked around the cabin with new eyes, seeing it as a place she might spend her days rather than just a temporary shelter. It was sparse but comfortable, with evident signs that Preston was a man who valued order and cleanliness. The books on the shelves surprised her, a mix of practical guides to ranching and animal husbandry, but also poetry, philosophy, and literature. She pulled down a volume of Whitman and flipped through it, seeing notes in the margins in a strong, slanted hand. Do you like poetry? Preston's voice came from the doorway, and Lillian jumped, nearly dropping the book. I do, she admitted, carefully replacing it on the shelf. I didn't expect to find Whitman in a cowboy's cabin. Preston leaned against the doorframe, wiping his hands on a rag. Cowboys read too, you know. My mother was a schoolteacher back in Texas. She made sure all her children knew their letters and could appreciate more than just cattle and horses. He crossed to the shelf and pulled down another volume. This one's my favorite, Tennyson. There's something about the rhythm of his words that reminds me of riding, of moving across open country. Lillian took the book he offered and opened it to a marked page. The Lady of Shalott, she read aloud. I know this one. We studied it in school. It's about isolation and longing, Preston said quietly. About watching life from a distance rather than living it. His gray-green eyes met hers. I understood that feeling before I came out here. In Texas, I was always my father's third son, the one who wouldn't inherit, the one who had to make his own way. Out here, I'm just myself, and that's enough. There was something in his words that resonated with Lillian, something that spoke to her own experience of displacement and reinvention. That's why I came west too, she said softly. To be myself, rather than what circumstances forced me to be. They stood there for a moment, the book between them, an understanding forming that went deeper than words. Then Preston cleared his throat and stepped back. Your horse is ready. Let me hitch up my wagon and we'll ride over to the Hendersons together. The journey to the Henderson ranch took them through beautiful country, hills covered in scrub and pine, with views that stretched for miles. The air was crisp and clean after the storm, and the sun felt warm on Lillian's face. Preston drove the wagon with easy competence, pointing out landmarks and explaining the lay of the land. He told her about the cattle operation he was building, how he'd started with just a dozen head 3 years ago, and had grown the herd to nearly 100 through careful breeding and hard work. It's not much compared to the big spreads in Texas, he said, but it's mine. No one can take it from me, and no one can tell me what to do with it. That means something. Lillian listened, fascinated by the passion in his voice. This was clearly a man who knew what he wanted and was willing to work for it. "Do you ever miss Texas, your family?" "Sometimes," Preston admitted. "But we write letters, and I went back for a visit last year. My sisters are both married now, got kids of their own. My parents are getting older, but they're still spry. They understand why I needed to leave, even if they wish I was closer." The Henderson Ranch appeared ahead, a cluster of buildings including a larger house than Preston's cabin, a substantial barn, and various outbuildings. Children played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the wind, and smoke rose from the chimney. A woman emerged from the house as they approached, shading her eyes with her hand, and her face broke into a smile when she recognized Preston. "Preston Quillen!" she called out. "What brings you over here, and who's that with you?" Preston pulled the wagon to a stop and jumped down, then turned to help Lillian descend. "Morning, Clara. This is Miss Lillian Montgomery. She ran into some trouble in last night's storm, and I've got a proposition for both of you." Clara Henderson was a solid woman in her mid-30s, with brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and a face that radiated warmth and good humor. She looked Lillian up and down with shrewd but kind eyes, and then smiled. "Any friend of Preston's is welcome here. Come inside, both of you, and we'll talk over coffee." The Henderson house was chaos in the best possible way, with children ranging from a toddler to a teenager moving through the space with comfortable familiarity. Sam Henderson was out checking on the cattle, Clara explained, but would be back by noon. She shooed the children outside and sat Preston and Lillian down at a scarred wooden table that had clearly seen years of family meals. Preston explained the situation, telling Clara about finding Lillian in the storm and his offer of employment. "The thing is," he concluded, "Miss Montgomery quite rightly pointed out that it wouldn't be proper for her to live at my place. A single woman with a single man. I was hoping she might be able to board here with you folks if you're willing. I'd pay for her room and board, of course, in addition to her wages." Clara looked at Lillian with assessing eyes. "You're a long way from home, aren't you, dear?" "Yes, madam," Lillian said quietly. "I came west from Boston. Things didn't work out as I'd planned, and I've been trying to make my way ever since. Mr. Quillen, Preston, has been very kind, but I don't want to impose on anyone." "It's not an imposition if we're getting paid," Clara said practically. "And Lord knows this house is chaotic enough that one more person won't make much difference." She paused, then leaned forward. "But I need to know you're respectable. Miss Montgomery, I have young daughters in this house, and I need to know you're a good influence." "I understand completely," Lillian said earnestly. "I'm a teacher by training, Mrs. Henderson, or I was hoping to be. I'm educated, I don't drink or gamble, and I attend church when there's one available. I'm just trying to build a life for myself in honest fashion." Clara nodded slowly, then turned to Preston. "And what exactly would her duties be at your place, Preston? You're not looking for anything improper, are you?" Preston's ears turned red. "Clara Henderson, you know me better than that. I need help with cooking and cleaning, maybe some mending and such. Nothing more. I give you my word." Clara's stern expression softened into a smile. "I know, Preston. I had to ask. You're a good man, one of the best I know. But I've got to look out for Miss Montgomery here, too." She turned back to Lillian. "All right, dear, you can stay here with us. We'll give you the small room off the kitchen. It's not fancy, but it's warm and dry and private. You'll take your meals with us when you're here, and I expect you to help wrangle these wild children of mine when needed. In return, you'll have a safe place to sleep and a family around you. Does that sound acceptable?" Relief flooded through Lillian so strongly she felt dizzy. "More than acceptable, Mrs. Henderson. Thank you so much. Call me Clara, dear. We don't stand on ceremony around here." Clara rose and refilled their coffee cups. "When do you want her to start, Preston?" "Tomorrow, if that works for everyone," Preston said. "That gives Miss Montgomery, Lillian, today to get settled in here and for everyone to get acquainted." And so it was arranged. Preston left an hour later, after Sam Henderson had returned and given his approval to the plan. Lillian spent the rest of the day being absorbed into the Henderson family chaos, meeting all 6 children ranging from 3-year-old Emma to 15-year-old Daniel, and learning the rhythms of the household. Clara was a force of nature, managing her brood with a combination of firm discipline and obvious affection, and she made Lillian feel welcome immediately. That night, lying in the small room off the kitchen, listening to the sounds of a family settling down for sleep, Lillian felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. She had a job, a place to stay, and people around her who seemed genuinely kind. And she couldn't deny the flutter in her chest when she thought of Preston Quillen, of his gray-green eyes and his gentle voice saying, "No one should face this storm alone." She told herself firmly that it was just gratitude, that she was simply appreciative of his kindness, but as she drifted off to sleep, it was his face she saw in her mind. The next morning, Clara drove her over to Preston's cabin in the Henderson wagon, with several of the children coming along for the ride. "I'll pick you up this evening," Clara said. "Preston, you make sure she gets a proper midday meal. She's too thin by half." "Yes, madam," Preston said with a grin. "I know better than to cross you, Clara Henderson." Preston and Lillian stood together in the yard as the wagon rolled away, and then he turned to her with a slightly nervous expression. "Well, shall we get to work? I should warn you, I'm not the tidiest person when I'm busy with the ranch. The cabin might be more of a mess than you remember." It wasn't too bad, actually. Preston had clearly made an effort to straighten up, though there were dirty dishes in the basin and dust on the shelves. Lillian set to work with a will, grateful to have something useful to do, and Preston disappeared outside to attend to his cattle. They fell into an easy routine over the next few hours. Lillian cleaned and organized, started a stew for the midday meal, and even did some mending on shirts she found that needed attention. Preston came in periodically to fetch tools or check on things, and each time he seemed surprised and pleased by the transformation taking place. "This is remarkable," he said at noon, looking around the cabin with wondering eyes. "I didn't realize how much I'd let things slide. It looks like a real home now." They sat down to eat together, and conversation flowed easily. Preston asked about her life in Boston, and she asked about his childhood in Texas. She learned that he was 28, that he'd left home at 22 to make his own fortune, and that he'd worked as a cowboy on various spreads before saving enough to buy his own land. He'd been here for 3 years, building his dream one day at a time. "It's lonely sometimes," he admitted. "The work is satisfying, but it's solitary. I've got the Hendersons nearby, and I go into Prescott every few weeks for supplies and to see people, but mostly it's just me and the cattle and the land." "Don't you want more?" Lillian asked. "A family of your own someday?" Preston's expression grew thoughtful. "I do, but finding the right person isn't easy out here. Most of the women in Prescott are already spoken for, and the ones who aren't are looking for men with more prospects than a small-time rancher barely scraping by." He looked at her directly. "What about you? You're a beautiful, educated woman. Surely you had suitors back in Boston." Lillian felt heat rise in her cheeks at the casual way he called her beautiful. "There was someone once," she said slowly. "A young lawyer who worked with my father. But when my father got sick and our circumstances changed, he found someone else with better prospects. I learned that what I thought was love was really just convenience." "Then he was a fool," Preston said quietly. "Anyone who couldn't see your worth, who would abandon you when times got hard, doesn't deserve you." Their eyes met across the table, and something electric passed between them. Lillian felt her breath catch, felt her heart begin to race, and she saw Preston's pupils dilate, saw him lean forward slightly as if drawn by an invisible force. Then a cow lowed loudly outside, breaking the spell, and Preston jerked back, clearing his throat. "I should get back to work," he said roughly. "There's fence that needs mending on the south pasture." "Of course," Lillian managed, her voice not quite steady. "I'll have supper ready when you come back in." Preston grabbed his hat and fled, and Lillian sat at the table for a long moment, her hand pressed to her racing heart. What was happening to her? She'd known this man for barely 2 days, and yet she felt drawn to him in a way she'd never experienced before. It was absurd. It was impractical. It was undeniable. She threw herself into her work, trying to outrun her thoughts, and by the time Preston returned in the late afternoon, she had the cabin spotless and a hearty meal ready. They ate with careful politeness, avoiding the intensity of their earlier conversation, and Lillian was almost relieved when Clara arrived to take her back to the Henderson ranch. But that night, alone in her small room, Lillian couldn't stop thinking about Preston, about the way he'd looked at her across the table, about the gentleness in his hands when he'd helped her with her buttons that first night, about the passion in his voice when he talked about his ranch and his dreams. She told herself she was being foolish, that she was just lonely and grateful and confused, but her heart whispered something different. The days turned into weeks, and Lillian settled into a rhythm that felt almost like normalcy. She spent her days at Preston's cabin, keeping house for him and preparing meals, and her evenings and nights with the Henderson family, helping Clara with the children, and feeling like part of something larger than herself. She began teaching the Henderson children their letters in the evenings, and Clara was delighted, saying it was worth having Lillian there for that alone. But it was Preston who occupied her thoughts constantly. They talked while she worked, and he did indoor chores on rainy days. They shared meals and books and stories from their pasts. She learned that he was thoughtful and kind, that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh, that he treated his animals with respect and care. He learned that she loved poetry and mathematics in equal measure, that she missed the ocean even though Boston's winter coast had been bitter cold, that she dreamed of having a school of her own someday where children could learn regardless of their ability to pay. The attraction between them grew like a living thing, undeniable and increasingly difficult to ignore. Lillian would catch Preston watching her as she worked, his eyes soft and wanting. Preston would find excuses to be near her, to brush past her in the small cabin, to let their hands touch when passing dishes or tools. Neither of them spoke of it, both aware of the complicated nature of their situation. She was his employee. She lived with another family. Any impropriety could ruin both their reputations. November gave way to December, and the weather turned colder. Snow fell in the high country, though the valleys remained mostly clear. Preston began preparing for winter in earnest, stocking supplies and reinforcing the barn and fences. Lillian helped where she could, and found herself learning about ranch life despite herself. She could now tell the difference between the various cattle, knew which ones were likely to calve in the spring, could help Preston with basic veterinary care when needed. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, waiting for Clara to pick her up, Preston said quietly, "You know, you're not what I expected." Lillian looked up from the socks she was darning. "What do you mean?" "When I pulled you out of that storm, I thought you were just another person passing through, someone who'd accept help and move on as soon as they could. But you've stayed. You've become part of things here. You've made this place feel like a home instead of just a house." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "I can't imagine what this place would be like without you anymore." Lillian's hand stilled on the sock. "I can't imagine being anywhere else," she admitted softly. "When I came west, I thought I was looking for a teaching position, for independence. But maybe I was really looking for this, for a place where I belong." "Do you?" Preston asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Belong here? I mean..." She met his eyes across the firelight and saw everything she felt reflected back at her. Want and hope and fear and longing. "I think I might," she whispered. Preston stood abruptly and crossed to where she sat, dropping to his knees beside her chair. He took the darning from her hands and set it aside, then captured both her hands in his. "Lillian, I know this is fast. I know we haven't known each other long, but I need you to know that I've come to care for you deeply, more than care for you. I think I'm falling in love with you." Lillian's breath left her in a rush. "Preston, I know I'm just a rancher with more ambition than money," he continued urgently. "I know I can't offer you the kind of life you grew up with in Boston, but I can offer you my whole heart. I can offer you partnership and respect and a future we build together. I can promise you that I will never abandon you when things get hard, that I will stand by your side no matter what comes." Tears spilled down Lillian's cheeks, but she was smiling. "Preston, you wonderful fool. Don't you know that I've been falling in love with you since that first night? Since you said no one should face this storm alone and took me in without question? I don't care about money or status. I care about you, about the man you are, the life you're building, the dreams you hold." Preston's face transformed with joy, and he reached up to cup her cheek, his thumb wiping away her tears. "Say it again," he demanded. "Say you love me." "I love you," Lillian said clearly. "I love you, Preston Quillen." He surged up and kissed her, and Lillian felt the world tilt sideways. His lips were warm and firm, moving against hers with a gentleness that made her ache. She wound her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the longing she'd been holding inside, and Preston groaned, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened, became more urgent, and Lillian forgot where she was, forgot everything except the feeling of his arms around her and his heart beating against hers. The sound of a wagon pulling up outside broke them apart, both of them breathing hard. Preston rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "That'll be Clara." "Preston, what do we do now?" Lillian asked, her voice shaking slightly. "I work for you. People will talk if they know." "Then we'll get married," Preston said simply, pulling back to look at her. "If you'll have me. I know it's fast, I know it's unconventional, but Lillian, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Marry me, be my wife, build this life with me." Lillian's heart hammered in her chest. Marriage. It was everything she wanted and everything that terrified her. But looking into Preston's eyes, seeing the honesty and hope there, she found her answer. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, I'll marry you." Preston kissed her again, quick and fierce, and then Clara's voice called from outside. "Lillian, you ready to head back?" They broke apart reluctantly, and Preston helped Lillian to her feet. "We'll talk more tomorrow," he promised. "Figure out the details, but tonight, just know that you've made me the happiest man alive." Lillian floated through the evening at the Henderson house, barely aware of what was happening around her. She was getting married. She was going to be Preston's wife. The man she loved wanted to spend his life with her. It felt like a dream, too perfect to be real. When she finally told Clara what had happened, the older woman's face broke into a huge smile. "I knew it," she crowed. "Sam, pay up. I told you those two would be engaged before Christmas." Sam Henderson grumbled good-naturedly and pulled a few coins from his pocket, handing them to his triumphant wife. "Congratulations, Lillian," he said with genuine warmth. "Preston's a good man. You'll be happy together." "But we've only known each other for a month," Lillian protested weakly. "Isn't that too fast?" Clara waved a dismissive hand. "Sam and I were engaged after 3 weeks and married 6 weeks after that. When you know, you know. Besides, you've been spending every day together for weeks now. You've probably spent more time with Preston than most courting couples do in a year." That was true, Lillian realized. They'd been living in close quarters, working together, learning each other's habits and quirks and dreams. In some ways, they knew each other better than couples who'd courted for years under the watchful eyes of chaperones. The next few weeks passed in a blur of planning. They decided to have a simple wedding in Prescott at the small church there, with the Hendersons and a few of Preston's other neighbors in attendance. Lillian had no family to invite, and Preston's family in Texas was too far away to come on short notice. But they agreed they'd visit them in the spring, so Preston could introduce his bride. Clara insisted on making Lillian a proper wedding dress, a simple but elegant affair in cream-colored wool. "It's not fancy," she said as she pinned the hem, "but it'll keep you warm in that drafty church, and you'll look beautiful." Preston threw himself into making improvements to the cabin, adding on a second room to give them more space, building new furniture, and generally working himself to exhaustion, trying to make everything perfect. Lillian scolded him gently when she saw the dark circles under his eyes, but she was touched by his dedication. They stole moments alone when they could, kisses in the barn, when Lillian brought him lunch, whispered conversations by the fire in the evening. Each touch, each kiss, deepened their connection, built anticipation for the wedding night when they could finally be together completely. The wedding was set for the 3rd week of December, a Saturday afternoon when the weather was clear and cold. The morning of the wedding, Lillian woke in her small room at the Henderson house with butterflies rioting in her stomach. This was it. Today she would become Mrs. Preston Quillen. Today her new life would truly begin. Clara helped her dress, plaiting her long hair into an intricate design and weaving in small flowers that had been dried from the summer. The cream dress fit perfectly, highlighting her figure while remaining modest and appropriate. When Lillian looked at herself in the small mirror, she barely recognized the pale, desperate woman Preston had pulled from the storm 2 months ago. The woman looking back at her now had color in her cheeks, hope in her eyes, and a smile on her lips. The church in Prescott was small but clean, decorated with pine boughs and candles. A handful of neighbors filled the pews, people who knew Preston and had welcomed Lillian into their community. The minister, an elderly man named Reverend Thomas, stood at the front with a kind smile, and there, waiting for her, was Preston. He wore a new suit that must have cost him dearly, his dark hair neatly combed, his face clean-shaven. But it was his eyes that caught her, gray-green and blazing with love and promise. As Sam Henderson escorted her down the short aisle, Preston's expression made her feel like the most beautiful, precious thing in the world. The ceremony was simple and traditional. They spoke their vows in clear, strong voices, promising to love and cherish each other for all their days. Preston's hand was steady as he slipped a simple gold band on her finger, but Lillian could see the emotion shimmering in his eyes. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife and told Preston he could kiss his bride, Preston pulled her close and kissed her with such tenderness that Lillian felt tears slide down her cheeks. The small gathering cheered, and then everyone adjourned to the Henderson Ranch for a wedding supper. Clara had outdone herself, preparing a feast that included roasted chickens, fresh bread, vegetables, and even a small cake. There was music and dancing, and Lillian found herself swept up in the celebration, passing from one neighbor to another as they offered congratulations and welcomes. But finally, as the sun began to set, Preston appeared at her side and whispered, "Ready to go home, Mrs. Quillen?" Mrs. Quillen. The name sent a thrill through her. "Yes," she said softly. "Let's go home." They said their goodbyes amid much teasing and laughter, and then Preston helped her into the wagon. The ride to the cabin was quiet, both of them acutely aware of what came next. The air felt charged with anticipation, and Lillian's nerves warred with her desire. She loved Preston, wanted to be with him completely, but she was also nervous about the unknown. Preston seemed to sense her tension because he reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "We don't have to rush anything," he said quietly. "Tonight is about us being together, about starting our life. Everything else can happen in its own time." His understanding made Lillian love him even more. When they reached the cabin, Preston lifted her down from the wagon with careful hands, then surprised her by sweeping her up in his arms. "I'm supposed to carry you over the threshold," he said with a grin. "It's tradition." Lillian laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck as he carried her through the door. The cabin looked warm and welcoming, the fire burning bright, candles lit on every surface. Preston must have asked someone to come prepare it while they were at the celebration. He set her down gently, and they stood there for a moment, just looking at each other. "I love you," Preston said, cupping her face in his hands. "Whatever happens from here, that's the foundation. I love you, Lillian." "I love you too," she whispered, and then they were kissing, the gentle touches giving way to deeper passion as weeks of restrained longing found release. Preston's hands moved over her back, learning the shape of her, and Lillian's fingers worked at the buttons of his shirt, wanting to feel his skin against hers. They made their way to the bed, shedding clothing between kisses, and came together with a mixture of tenderness and urgency that left them both breathless. Preston was patient and careful, making sure Lillian felt pleasure as well as brief pain, and afterwards they lay tangled together, skin against skin, hearts beating in sync. "Are you all right?" Preston murmured against her hair, his hand tracing lazy patterns on her back. "More than all right," Lillian assured him, pressing a kiss to his chest. "Perfect." They talked long into the night, sharing dreams and fears and hopes for the future. Preston wanted to expand the ranch, build a larger house, maybe raise horses as well as cattle. Lillian talked about her dream of opening a school, teaching children who might not otherwise have access to education. They made plans and promises, building a future together with their words. As winter settled over the land, Preston and Lillian settled into married life with surprising ease. The cabin that had once seemed small now felt cozy, a warm nest against the cold outside. They worked together seamlessly, Preston handling the cattle and outdoor work while Lillian managed the house and began planning for the spring garden. On days when the weather was too harsh for outdoor work, Preston would read aloud to her while she did mending, or they'd play cards by the fire, or simply talk about everything and nothing. They visited the Hendersons often, and Lillian continued helping Clara with the children and their education. She also began teaching reading and writing to several other children in the area whose families lived too far from any proper school. Word spread, and by January, Lillian had a dozen students coming to the cabin 2 afternoons a week. Preston helped by building benches and a large table for the lessons, and he beamed with pride when he saw Lillian in her element, patient and encouraging with even the most struggling student. "You're a natural teacher," he told her one evening after the last student had gone home. "The way those children's faces light up when they finally understand something, that's magic." "It's not magic, it's patience and practice," Lillian said, but she was pleased. This felt right, using her skills to help her community. It wasn't a formal school yet, but it was a start. Winter deepened, and January gave way to February. The work was hard but satisfying. Preston's cattle came through the cold weather in good shape, and he began planning for spring roundup. Lillian discovered she was pregnant in late February, and the joy on Preston's face when she told him made her heart swell. "A baby," he breathed, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Lillian asked, though she could see the answer on his face. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Preston said, pulling her into his arms. "You've given me everything, Lillian. A home, a purpose, love, and now a child. I'm the luckiest man alive." They told the Hendersons the news, and Clara immediately went into mothering mode, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and stern lectures about Lillian not overworking herself. Preston became almost comically protective, not wanting Lillian to lift anything heavy or work too hard, and she had to constantly assure him that she was fine, that pregnancy wasn't an illness. Spring arrived with an explosion of green and life. The cattle calves were born, strong and healthy, and Preston's herd continued to grow. Lillian's students multiplied as word spread about her teaching, and she began holding classes 4 days a week instead of 2. Her belly swelled with the baby, and she felt it move inside her, a flutter that grew into definite kicks. Summer brought long, hot days and hard work. Preston hired a young cowboy named Tommy to help with the expanded herd, and the extra hands made a huge difference. They began building a larger house with proper rooms and a space that could serve as a real classroom for Lillian's students. The cabin would become a bunkhouse for Tommy and any other hands they might hire in the future. Lillian taught as long as she could, finally stopping her classes in August when she was too large and uncomfortable to stand for long periods. Clara came to stay with them as her due date approached, and Preston wore a path in the floor with his nervous pacing. The baby came on a hot September night, a long labor that left Lillian exhausted but exhilarated. Preston was there for all of it, holding her hand, wiping her brow, whispering encouragement. When the baby finally emerged with a lusty cry, Clara announced, "It's a boy! You have a son!" Preston cried openly as Clara placed the baby in his arms, staring down at the tiny red face with wonder. "He's perfect," he breathed. "Lillian, he's perfect." They named him Henry Samuel Quillen, Henry for Lillian's father, and Samuel for their friend who had given them so much support. Henry was a healthy, hungry baby who grew like a weed, and Preston was a devoted father, walking the floor with him at night, changing diapers without complaint. Staring at him with such love, it made Lillian's heart ache. The new house was finished by October, a solid structure with 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, a parlor, and a room dedicated to Lillian's teaching. They moved in with a sense of accomplishment and gratitude, and Preston hung a sign over the door that read, "Quillen Family Ranch, established 1883. "That's the year I found you," he explained when Lillian questioned the date. "The year my real life began." Lillian resumed her teaching in the new schoolroom, this time with Henry in a cradle nearby. She had 18 students now, ranging in age from 5 to 14, and she loved every chaotic minute of it. Preston expanded the ranch further, adding horses to their operation, and the business thrived. Years passed in a blur of work and love and family. Henry was joined by a daughter, Elizabeth, 2 years later, and then another son, James, 2 years after that. The ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful small operations in the territory. Lillian's school became official, recognized by the territorial government, and she even received a small stipend to help with supplies. They visited Preston's family in Texas when the children were old enough to travel, and Lillian fell in love with Preston's sisters and their families. His parents welcomed her warmly, and his mother cried when she saw how happy Preston was. "Thank you," she told Lillian privately. "Thank you for giving him the life he deserved, the happiness he needed." The Hendersons remained close friends, their children growing up alongside the Quillen children. Clara and Lillian became like sisters, supporting each other through the joys and challenges of frontier life. When Sam Henderson died suddenly of a heart attack in 1891, Preston and Lillian took in the 2 youngest Henderson children until Clara could get back on her feet financially. Life wasn't always easy. There were droughts and harsh winters, cattle disease and market crashes, There were nights when Preston worried about making ends meet, days when Lillian was so exhausted from teaching and mothering that she could barely stand. But they faced everything together, their love deepening with each challenge overcome, each crisis navigated. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston took Lillian on a picnic to a hill overlooking their ranch. They sat together watching the sunset, their children playing nearby, the sounds of the cattle lowing in the distance. Preston put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Giving up your dreams of a big school, of a different kind of life?" Lillian looked out at the land they had built together, at their children laughing in the golden light, at the house that held their life and their love. "This is my dream," she said firmly. "You are my dream. All of this is more than I ever imagined was possible. Even when I pulled you out of that storm, half frozen and desperate, I had no idea what you'd come to mean to me," Preston said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved me as much as I saved you that night, Lillian. You gave me purpose and partnership, and a love I didn't know existed." "No one should face storms alone," Lillian said softly, echoing his words from the long-ago night. "That's what you taught me, and we haven't. We've faced everything together." Preston turned her face to his and kissed her, slow and sweet and full of promise. "Here's to the next 10 years, he murmured against her lips. "And the 10 after that, and the 10 after that, until we're old and gray and still driving each other crazy." Lillian laughed, the sound floating across the land they'd tamed together. "I can't think of anything I'd like more." The years continued to unfold, bringing change and growth. The children grew tall and strong, educated in their mother's school and trained in ranching by their father. Henry showed a talent for working with horses. Elizabeth inherited her mother's love of teaching, and James had his father's head for business. The ranch continued to expand, and eventually Preston was able to buy the Henderson spread when Clara decided to move to Prescott to live with her eldest son. Arizona Territory became the state of Arizona in 1912, and Preston and Lillian took their children to Phoenix for the celebration. Standing in the crowd, watching the flag being raised, Preston leaned down to whisper in Lillian's ear, "We're part of history now. We helped build this state." And they had. Through their ranch, through Lillian's school, which had educated hundreds of children over the years, through their involvement in the community, they'd contributed to the growth and development of this wild land. It was something to be proud of. The children grew up and began lives of their own. Henry married a girl from Prescott and took over the day-to-day running of the ranch. Elizabeth went to teachers' college in California and then returned to take over her mother's school, expanding it further. James went into business in Phoenix, but came home often, unable to stay away from the land that had shaped him. Preston and Lillian grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces lining with years of sun and laughter. But the love between them never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by decades of partnership and mutual respect. They were still known to hold hands while walking around the ranch, still caught kissing in the barn by embarrassed grandchildren. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a huge celebration. The house overflowed with family and friends, the sound of music and laughter carrying across the land. Preston stood to give a toast, raising his glass and looking at Lillian with eyes still full of love. 30 years ago, he said, his voice carrying over the crowd, I found this woman in the middle of a storm, half frozen and desperate. I had no idea that in saving her life, she'd end up saving mine. Lillian, you've been my partner, my lover, my best friend, and my compass. Everything good in my life came from that night when I said, no one should face this storm alone, and you trusted me enough to come inside. Here's to you, my love. Here's to the life we've built. Here's to every storm we've weathered together. The crowd cheered and clinked glasses, but Lillian only had eyes for Preston. She stood and crossed to him, taking his face in her hands. And here's to you, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. The man who taught me what love really means. The man who has stood by my side through every joy and every sorrow. The man who gave me a home, a family, and a purpose. I love you, Preston Quillen. I loved you that first night when you pulled me from the storm, and I'll love you until my last breath. They kissed to thunderous applause, and the celebration continued long into the night. But later, when everyone had gone to bed and the house was finally quiet, Preston and Lillian sat together on the porch of their home, looking up at the stars. 30 years, Lillian marveled. It feels like yesterday, and like forever ago all at once. Best 30 years of my life, Preston said, pulling her closer. Do you remember how scared you were that first night? How you could barely speak from the cold? I remember thinking I was going to die, Lillian said honestly. And then you appeared like an answer to a prayer I didn't even know I'd said. You were so calm, so certain. You made me feel safe immediately. I took one look at you and something in me just knew, Preston confessed. I didn't understand it then, but I felt it. This sense that you were important, that I needed to take care of you. And then, as I got to know you, I realized it wasn't about taking care of you at all. It was about being partners, building something together. We've built a good life, Lillian said contentedly, surveying the land that had become so much more than she'd ever dreamed. A family, a ranch, a school, a community. We've left something behind that matters. The best legacy isn't the land or the buildings, Preston said quietly. It's the children we raised, the students you taught, the love we showed them all. That's what will endure. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the night air cool and pleasant around them. Finally, Preston stood and offered Lillian his hand. Come to bed, wife. We've got more years ahead of us, and I plan to make every one of them count. Lillian took his hand and rose, letting him lead her inside to the bedroom they had shared for 3 decades. As they settled into bed, wrapped in each other's arms, she thought about that stormy November night so many years ago. She'd been lost and desperate, certain her life was over. Instead, it had been just beginning. Preston, she murmured sleepily. Thank you for finding me that night. Thank you for not letting me face that storm alone. Preston's arms tightened around her. Finding you was the best thing I ever did. I'd ride through 1,000 storms if I knew you'd be waiting at the end. Lillian smiled against his chest and let sleep claim her, safe and warm and loved beyond measure. Outside, the wind picked up, but inside, they were sheltered from any storm. Together, they could face anything. Together, they had built something that would last far beyond their own lives. Together, they had found what everyone searches for, a love that endures through all seasons, all challenges, all the years that life brings. The ranch continued to thrive as the years progressed. Henry proved to be an astute manager, combining his father's work ethic with modern techniques he learned from agricultural journals. The Quillen family brand became respected throughout Arizona, known for quality cattle and horses. Elizabeth's school grew into one of the finest in the region, with students coming from 50 miles around to receive an education. She married a lawyer from Phoenix and brought him back to help manage the expanding enterprise. And together, they built dormitories so students from far away could board during the school term. James's business ventures in Phoenix provided crucial capital for expansion during the lean years, and he always credited his success to the values his parents had instilled in him. Work hard, treat people fairly, and never give up even when circumstances are difficult. He eventually served in the state legislature, representing the interests of rural Arizonans, and was known for his integrity and common sense. Preston and Lillian watched their children's successes with quiet pride, but their greatest joy came from their grandchildren. By 1920, they had 12 grandchildren ranging from infants to teenagers, and the house was constantly full of noise and laughter and chaos. Preston would sit in his rocking chair on the porch with a grandchild on each knee, telling stories of the old days when Arizona was still a territory and cowboys still drove cattle on open range. Lillian taught each grandchild to read, instilling in them the same love of learning that had sustained her through difficult times. They grew old gracefully, still active in their 70s, still engaged with their family and community. Preston still rode out to check on the cattle most days, though Henry tried to convince him to take it easier. Lillian still taught reading to the youngest grandchildren, still involved herself in the school's operations, still corresponded with former students scattered across the country. In the spring of 1923, Preston fell ill with pneumonia. He fought it stubbornly, refusing to stay in bed, insisting he was fine. But even his formidable will couldn't overcome his aging body's limitations. The family gathered, called home by telegrams, and they took turns sitting with him as he grew weaker. Lillian never left his side. She held his hand, bathed his forehead, and told him stories of their life together. On a warm April morning, with the window open and the smell of spring flowers drifting in, Preston opened his eyes and looked at her with perfect clarity. "My beautiful Lillian," he rasped. "My storm-tossed girl who became the strongest woman I know." "Don't talk," Lillian said, tears streaming down her face. "Save your strength." "For what?" Preston smiled slightly. "Lillian, I need you to know something. Every single day with you has been a gift. Every morning I woke up beside you. Every evening we sat together. Every challenge we faced and every joy we celebrated. All of it was more than I deserved." "Preston, please, let me finish," he insisted gently. "You made my life meaningful. You gave me purpose and love and a family I'm so proud of. I have no regrets, Lillian. None. And I need you to promise me that you'll keep living, keep teaching, keep loving. Don't let my death stop your life." "How can I live without you?" Lillian choked out. "You're my other half." "No," Preston said firmly, squeezing her hand with what strength he had left. "You were always whole. Lillian, you didn't need me to complete you. We chose to walk together, and it was glorious, but you're strong enough to walk alone if you have to. Promise me you'll keep going." "I promise," Lillian whispered, though she couldn't imagine how she'd keep that promise. Preston smiled, satisfied. "That's my girl. Thank you for 39 years of joy, my love. Thank you for saying yes to that crazy cowboy who pulled you from a storm." His eyes drifted closed. No one should face storms alone. We didn't. We faced them all together. Those were his last words. Preston Quillen died peacefully that afternoon, surrounded by his wife, his children, his grandchildren, and the love that had defined his life. The funeral was the largest the region had ever seen, with people coming from across the state to pay their respects to a man who had been a pillar of his community. Lillian thought she might die from grief. The pain of losing Preston was physical, a constant ache in her chest that made breathing difficult. But she had promised him she'd keep living, and Lillian Montgomery Quillen had never broken a promise in her life. So, she got up each morning, she helped with the ranch, she taught her grandchildren, and she kept moving forward. The family rallied around her, making sure she was never alone unless she wanted to be. Henry moved her into the main house so she wouldn't have to rattle around by herself. Elizabeth brought her great-grandchildren to visit, knowing how their innocent joy lifted her spirits. James came home from Phoenix every weekend, bringing news and gossip and making sure his mother knew she was loved. Slowly, gradually, the grief became something Lillian could carry rather than something that crushed her. She found herself able to smile again, to laugh at grandchildren's antics, to take pleasure in simple things like sunrise and good coffee and the first flowers of spring. She knew Preston would never truly be gone as long as she remembered him, as long as she told their stories to the next generations, as long as the legacy they had built together continued. Lillian lived 8 more years, active and engaged until nearly the end. She was 84 when she quietly died in her sleep one winter night, simply not waking up one morning in late 1931. Her family mourned, but there was also a sense of rightness. She had lived a full, rich life, had loved deeply and been deeply loved, and was now reunited with Preston. They buried her beside him on the hill overlooking the ranch, the same hill where they had picnicked on their 10th anniversary. The entire community came to the funeral, testimony to the impact one woman's life had made. Former students, now with gray hair of their own, spoke tearfully of how Mrs. Quillen had changed their lives, opening worlds through education that they'd never imagined possible. Neighbors talked about her kindness and strength. Families simply tried to express the inexpressible, how to explain what it meant to have had such a mother, such a grandmother, such an anchor in their lives. As the sun set over the ranch that day, over the land that Preston and Lillian had tamed together, it seemed fitting somehow. 2 people who had started with nothing, who had found each other in the midst of a storm, had built something that would last for generations. The Quillen family ranch still stands today, run by Preston and Lillian's descendants. Elizabeth School grew into a respected institution that educated thousands. James's political legacy influenced Arizona policy for decades. But perhaps their greatest legacy was simpler than all of that. They had shown that love could thrive in the harshest conditions, that partnership and respect could build something lasting, and that no one, truly, should have to face life's storms alone. Preston had saved Lillian from literal death that stormy November night in 1883, but she had saved him too, from a life of loneliness and limited dreams. Together, they had built not just a ranch or a school or a family, but a love story that would be told and retold for generations, inspiring others to believe that true partnership, true love, and true happiness were possible even in the hardest circumstances. Their graves stand side by side on that hill, the headstones simple but elegant. Preston Quillen, beloved husband and father, 1855-1923. Lillian Montgomery Quillen, beloved wife and mother, teacher and friend, 1857-1931. And beneath both names, the same inscription: "No one faces the storm alone." On summer evenings, their great-great-grandchildren sometimes climb that hill to watch the sunset over the ranch. They've heard the stories dozens of times about how Preston found Lillian in that terrible storm, about how they fell in love, about how they built the foundation of everything the family has today. The stories have taken on an almost mythical quality over the years, but at their heart, they remain true. Two people finding each other when they needed it most, choosing to face life together, and building something beautiful from nothing but love and determination and hard work. The ranch itself has changed with the times, modernizing and expanding, but certain things remain constant. The original cabin still stands, preserved now as a museum piece, and visitors can see where Preston and Lillian first set up housekeeping together. The schoolroom where Lillian taught has been restored and is still used for special occasions. The hill where they're buried is considered sacred ground by the family, a place to go for reflection and remembrance. Every year on the anniversary of that stormy night in November 1883, the family gathers at the ranch for a celebration. They tell the stories again, ensuring that new generations know where they came from and what their ancestors sacrificed and achieved. Children act out the moment when Preston found Lillian in the storm. Teenagers roll their eyes but secretly love hearing about the romance that followed. Adults reflect on the enduring lessons of partnership and perseverance. The land itself seems to remember. On stormy nights, when the wind howls and rain lashes the windows, it's easy to imagine a young woman stumbling through the mud, desperate and freezing, and a young man emerging from his cabin with a lantern held high. Easy to hear his voice cutting through the storm. No one should face this storm alone. Those words became more than just a moment of kindness. They became a philosophy, a way of life that Preston and Lillian instilled in their children and grandchildren and all who came after. The Quillen family became known throughout Arizona for their community involvement, their willingness to help neighbors in need, their commitment to ensuring that no one in their sphere had to struggle alone. It was their parents' legacy, and they honored it daily. The love story of Preston and Lillian Quillen proved that the best romances aren't about perfect people or perfect circumstances. They're about two imperfect people choosing each other, day after day, through good times and bad, through storms and sunshine, through loss and joy. Preston and Lillian had faced it all together, hand in hand, heart to heart. And in doing so, they'd created something that transcended their individual lives. On quiet mornings when mist rises from the valley and the ranch is just waking up, some say you can still feel their presence. A sense of peace and rightness, of love that endures beyond death, of two souls who found each other against all odds and held tight through every storm life threw at them. The cowboys heading out to check on cattle, the students arriving at the school, the family members going about their daily tasks, all move through a space shaped by Preston and Lillian's love and vision. And so, the story that began on a stormy November night in 1883, with a desperate woman and a compassionate man, continues to echo through time. It reminds us that our lowest moments might be preludes to our greatest joys, that kindness can change everything, that love is worth fighting for, and that together, truly together, we can weather any storm life brings. Preston and Lillian Quillen's love story didn't end with their deaths. It lives on in every descendant who values partnership, in every act of community kindness, in every person who chooses to extend help to someone in need. No one should face the storm alone. Preston said it. Lillian believed it. Together, they lived it. And in living it, they created a legacy that will endure as long as their descendants remember, as long as the land they loved continues to flourish, as long as love itself survives. They were just a cowboy and a teacher who found each other in the wilderness, but they became something more, a testament to the power of love, the importance of partnership, and the truth that no storm is truly insurmountable when you face it with someone who loves you, someone who chooses you, someone who promises to stand by your side no matter what comes. Their story is complete now, beginning and middle and end all accounted for. From that desperate moment in the storm to decades of love and family and achievement, from first kiss to final goodbye, from two individuals to one enduring partnership. Preston and Lillian Quillen lived fully, loved deeply, and left behind a legacy that matters. And really, what more can any of us hope for than that?